Wavelength.
Just because we're doing our lectures online doesn't mean that we need to then retreat and make life, all about being alone.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide.
I think there's not enough knowledge around the severity of the long-term impacts that a concussion can give you, and it's not really educated enough.
You should be having.
The minimum job search requirements is definitely problematic, and it is up to a computer to decide whether you receive your payments each month.
This is Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Hello, Adelaide. God, I love a Monday night when I'm in the studio sitting across from the lovely Grace and talking to you all.
Oh, isn't it nice?
It's actually, there's nothing better.
Oh, it's our special time to get the cast. Obviously, with everyone else, of course.
It's like a little sleepover, but with all your best friends.
Let's set up a tent.
In the studio, we'll check with our content director. She's giving me the thumbs up. Tent's coming out.
I wasn't even going to check. We're just going to do it. But it has been very cold in Adelaide this week. And so before we jump in, we do need to acknowledge that we are recording Wavelength on the land of the Kaurna people in the Adelaide Plains and pay respect to elders past and present.
We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We acknowledge that there are continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today, and we also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations.
I swear, we do say every episode how crazy the news has gotten, and we're not just saying that so you listen every time, but it's true. It just keeps happening.
Absolutely, that's right. So get comfy, and most importantly, Grace, get excited. We have a massive episode full of some super, super important stories, and tonight we're talking about the South Australian Museum and its decrease of its workers with Michael Mills and the opposition leader, David Spiers.
Yes, that will be coming up later in the episode. And we're also talking about new family laws, and Cass, you go through into the end of the episode by cheering us up with some heaps good news.
A lot is happening in the next hour. Shall we just jump right in? The story is something that is exceptionally close to mine and a lot of people's hearts across Australia. 33 women have been violently killed this year alone, and this is a 30% increase from 2022.
Yes, that's right, Cass. This is in the heart of so many Australians right now and people around the world. Domestic violence is a suffocating and all-consuming situation which threatens the lives and well-beings of so many people. Tonight, Izzy speaking with Mary Leaker, the General Manager of Embolden SA's peak body for domestic, family and sexual violence services, about this topic to find out more.
Take it away.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Certainly there's been an increase in the number of women who've been killed as a result of domestic and family violence, and I think that causes a lot of concern and anger in the community. We can see instances where there's been such clear system failures. So, one recent example is young childcare worker and mother Molly Ticehurst in regional New South Wales, who was allegedly murdered by her ex-partner, who was released on bail, and so obviously the person making that bail decision didn't see him as an unacceptable risk to Molly Ticehurst's safety. And yet in the months preceding her murder, he had been charged with an absolutely kind of terrorising campaign of offences. This is a man who should not have been let out on bail. And when the community sees that, very understandably, we're outraged.
A woman is dying at the hands of their partner or ex-partner every 4 days. This year's toll of women being killed by violence is 12% higher than this time last year. It's quite scary figures. How can we prevent and stop this from happening?
Well, that is the more than $1 million question. It's important to note that domestic and family violence is highly complex and, what has been called a wicked social problem. Yeah. And we need to prevent and respond to it across a really broad range of settings and mechanisms. But as you will see in the national, we have a national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. And you'll see that the key areas of focus range across what we can do to prevent violence from happening in the first place. How do we intervene early? What do we do when women are actually experiencing and attempting to escape violence? So our crisis response, recognising the importance of these strong services to support women who are recovering and healing from violence. We really need greater investment in our services targeted to men who are at risk of using violence or who are using violence. It's a whole of community, whole of government responsibility. How are we broadly in the community understanding and recognising gender-based violence? But we need the political will, the resources and the expertise, and we need to sustain that effort.
What can we do as a community to combat this issue?
A lot of people have been talking for a long time about the fact that we need to change our culture so that there's greater respect for women and girls.
Yeah.
Women and girls are not considered less than. There's zero tolerance in our community for gender-based violence and misogyny. So those things are really important. As a community, it's really important that we understand the nature of domestic abuse. What's now called coercive control is really most often the kind of underpinning dynamic in domestic and family violence. And so we need our community to recognise coercive and controlling behaviours as a risk factor. And we need our community to know where anyone who is experiencing violence or using violence can go for help and support. You know, nothing changes if people don't realise that help and support is available to them.
We had the No More National rallies held over the weekend right across the country, and I believe you got to speak in front of Parliament House in Adelaide over the weekend. Is that correct?
I did. I had the privilege of speaking at the Adelaide rally.
What was your main takeaway from the rallies, and how important was that going forward?
The rallies really have precipitated new conversations and collaboration at the highest levels of government nationally. You know, our sector will certainly be keeping a very close eye on the outcomes from the announcements made yesterday following the National Cabinet meeting. We're very supportive of the announcements made in relation to addressing online harms. We also support the Leaving Violence payments that were announced, which is about recognising that there are often financial barriers to women escaping a domestic and family violence situation. But there were things that we didn't see come out of National Cabinet that we would have liked to have seen.
I believe the Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner, Michaela Cronin, has organised a crisis meeting for May 7th. What do you hope to see come out of that meeting? Are they things that weren't discussed or weren't successful in the National Cabinet? And what steps should the government take?
One of the things that we really are very keen to see more action on is around preventing and disrupting the harm caused by high-risk perpetrators. There are perpetrators out there who have been charged with or have committed multiple offences against the same person, and also perpetrators who go from partner to partner to partner committing harm and violence. And so we really were very keen for National Cabinet to have clear announcements and create some mechanisms around how states and territories could work together. I would like some more clarity around that at the Commissioners' Roundtable.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide, you should be having Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Thanks for that, Izzy and Mary. This is a really important discussion that I think needs to remain in the tops of everyone's heads going forward. Check in with your friends or family and make sure that they are safe and that they are okay. Like she mentioned in the interview, Anthony Albanese has declared that this is a national crisis following protests across the country.
Yes, he has mentioned. And South Australia has responded with tightening the domestic violence laws, as well as the federal government committing to investing, it was $925 million over the next 5 years to help women leave violent and unsafe environments. I think there's kind of two takeaways I'm getting from all of this discourse at the moment, and that's kind of a social setting, seeing a lot of men responding to all this press by saying it's not all men. And I think there's a few sides that, of course, a lot of the times men will see that and they know that they're not the problems. They don't have the discourse. It's obviously not about you if it's not what you're doing then. Yeah. And if you are barking up, of course, not every man is violent and unsafe, but it's about, like, I've been around groups of men and had encounters and none of my other male friends stood up for me. Yeah. It's about backing up females and those identify as such when they need you. It's not about you committing the act yourself. It's about if you can help stop it, getting it done. Whether it's awkward or not, imagine how much worse it is for someone experiencing it. And then on the flip side of that, government change. I myself, unfortunately, I'll keep it so nice and vague, have had to go to police for certain things, and I've been told, oh, we need to wait for something to happen before we can do anything about that. And it's like, here is A, B, C, D that's going to lead to whatever. We can be stopping this and you're telling me we can't. It's got to change.
Absolutely. And I think silence is being complicit. I think a lot of the time, like bringing up this conversation with a lot of my male friends or just men in my life, they do tend to kind of flip it into this way. And I'm not trying to generalize here, but talking about mental health of men and those discussions are so important.
Absolutely.
They're so important. I think the issue comes when we're only bringing up those discussions in retaliation to talking about women's violence or women's issues.
It's not the topic right now. That's not what we're talking about. We validate that and understand it so deeply, but that's not what we're challenging right now. It needs to be tackled, but so does this.
Absolutely. And if you or someone needs help, know that you are not alone. You can call 1-800-737-732. Everyone deserves a safe home life.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Before the break, we spoke about the harrowing domestic violence statistics.
Right now, we are talking about the SA Museum and its plans to demolish research positions.
Yes, and our newest recruit, Liz, spoke with David Spiers, the opposition leader, to find out what's going on.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Could you give us a brief explanation about your Save the South Australian Museum campaign?
The Liberal Party is really concerned about some major changes proposed to the South Australian Museum. There has been a proposal to strip away the scientific wing of the museum, and we're particularly concerned about that. There's a proposal to get rid of 27 scientific research positions. Now, they're going to replace those with 22 other positions, but it'll be quite a different approach. It'll really dilute the scientific research. And also some of the most loved galleries, most visited galleries, because they've been around for a long time, there's a bit of push from the museum's curators and management to change those galleries. But people keep on going to them time and time again. We're talking about the Stuffed Mammals Gallery. And people think, well, that's old-fashioned, but people love seeing that. I guess our position is, why change something for the sake of it just because there's new management in town?
Do you think the plans for the restructure of the South Australian Museum could have been brought about differently?
I certainly think they could have been worked through with the South Australian community better. I see this as a community-owned institution. It has had a lot of investment from thousands of South Australians over really well over 100 years.
You've encouraged South Australians to sign a parliamentary inquiry into these changes. I believe there needed to be 10,000 signatures to prompt the inquiry. With the recent news of a review and the restructure on hold, what involvement did you have in these events?
South Australia has a law which says if we get 10,000 signatures presented on a petition in the right format, the parliamentary format, that can trigger a parliamentary inquiry into the particular issue. We're not at 10,000 signatures yet, but that process really, I think, shocked the government into saying they're going to put a pause on these changes. So we had a stall outside the museum, which the museum management didn't love very much, but the South Australian public certainly did. And right through the school holidays, we had queues of people to sign that.
Do you think the process of the Premier's review is satisfactory? Is this the right way to understand what the people want?
I don't like this review at all, actually. So, yes, we've been able to get the changes put on hold. That's a good thing. As I said, I'd like to see them cancelled. But the review that's been put in place is really the Premier's department reviewing Premier's department. The Chief Executive of the Premier's department is leading the review. But the museum sits within the Premier's department, so it doesn't have independence associated with it. I'm really worried about that.
Despite your hopes for a parliamentary inquiry, what are your hopes for the outcome of the review?
Our much-loved displays and galleries should be retained if South Australians want them. And when you look at the footfall in the museum, the areas of the museum that are visited most, it is the older galleries that have been around for years, the ones that your listeners would remember going to see when they were at school. And actually, their parents probably remember doing the same thing. Again, it's okay to retain things. You don't need to throw them out just because they're old. So hopefully we'll get a process through this review which says we will get more community input into how the museum is shaped well into the future, and also to be able to stop some of these less popular changes.
What challenges could South Australians see in the future if the restructure goes ahead?
One of the things that we could really see is the loss of the scientific expertise within the museum. We're still discovering plants and animals in this state. If you find an animal like this in South Australia, the place to take it is actually the South Australian Museum. You take it to the scientific wing, they study it, they make sure it is a new discovery, they document it, they keep samples of it. That's all held in the museum. It's a hidden part of the museum, but it's so important. And if this restructure goes ahead, we could lose that expertise, that deep understanding of the natural world in South Australia, and our state will be poorer for it.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Thank you so much for that, Liz and David. Obviously, I don't know the decision the new management would take into their reasoning behind scrapping it. If it's just because it's old, I think that's so bizarre. I mean, if there's not like the demand for something else overtaking that area, which obviously makes more sense to bring in, I suppose. If people love it and they're so passionate about it, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I think maybe this is just a dumb comment here, but isn't a museum about old things? Is that was like the first thing that came to my mind, because it is about showing old things. That's the whole point of a museum, is about talking about history, right?
Yeah. Confusing stuff. You're onto something here, Cass.
Maybe I am. Maybe they should bring me into the conversation. I
think so.
Bring it a lot, telling them what a museum is.
They're asking for it. We got to get 10,000 of us and then it's staying. Is that not correct? Well, they'll look into it staying.
Yes, absolutely.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength. Right now, we are speaking with Michael Mills to tell us more about what's going on with the SA Museum. Let's get into it, Liz.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
The restructure to the South Australian Museum has been labelled a reimagining. What exactly does that entail?
I think the problem with when you start to use a word like reimagine is that people see it as jargon, and whether that's the intention or not. Because the problem of using that word is that once you lose that word, you lose the narrative. And stories are really important. Ultimately, what the museum is about is it's a collection of stories. It's a collection of our stories as South Australians. And I think that's why this process has ignited so much passion.
How will the restructure affect the quality and research in the South Australian Museum?
I think the impact is hard to know. And it's hard to know because the museum's not been like this before. One of the most troubling elements of this whole process is the arts minister, who is constantly saying the museum is adequately funded. There is no one that knows about the museum that goes in those walls. There is no one that I know, and I've been around that place doing things for 20 years. There is no one that thinks the museum is adequately funded.
How might the accuracy of exhibitions be affected?
Well, the challenge of any public exhibition is to ensure accuracy of the content. I've been really lucky under the existing structure and the existing system of performing to tens of thousands of people over the years, recording a whole bunch of albums and things, and those albums are born of the research by the researchers, a lot of them at the South Australian Museum. And I find the researchers at the museum have been so generous. I've been able to go on fossil digs, because of the trust that we've developed over the years. And none of that's that hard. This is a community of people within the museum who are openly willing to share their research.
I believe you were at the protest at Parliament House recently. Could you explain the main criticisms and concerns raised by the public?
Yeah, one of the main concerns raised was the lack of consultation. The Public Service Association were there and they spoke very clearly about the museum not acting in good faith with their negotiations. Now, that's quite a damning description of a conversation between the staff. And the staff there were staff who found out about the restructure on a PowerPoint and a meeting.
Now, looking at the museum as a whole, what meaning do you believe it has for South Australia?
I love the museum and its stories. And, you're in, I'll give you an example. You're in the Megafauna Gallery and there's a Diprotodon skeleton, which is sort of like a wombat, but it's not, but it's giant. It's big as a hippopotamus. You're standing, and there's a giant short-faced kangaroo and a thylacoleo, which is kind of like a drop bear, but real. And you're standing next to animals that lived where you are standing, but lived there 50,000 years ago, or lived here 50,000 years ago. You're walking in the footsteps of the megafauna. You're walking in the footsteps of, or the flipper steps of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. So all of these things that once lived in this place we call South Australia. That's the legacy. The legacy is the stories and connecting those stories to people. And I think whatever the museum does is that looking after those collections and sharing those stories has to be the legacy.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Thank you so much for that, Liz and Michael. What an interesting story. Please go down and support the SA Museum. It's fantastic.
Yes, it's so beautiful for the public, and as we heard there, so many professionals. Like, there's not many spaces to be doing the type of work they were doing, so we want to keep it there for them.
Wavelength.
You're on Wavelength, and it's time for Wavelength Explains. Can you guess? It's where we explain things.
Really?
Yeah, it is. And we're about to do it right now. We dive into a topic, and maybe you haven't heard much about it, or you just know the headlines and want to know more.
Yeah, and this week we are talking about the changes to family laws that actually start today.
Take it away, Ella.
Wavelength Explains on Fresh 92.7. From May 6, new amendments to the Family Law Act will be enacted into Australian law. But what do these changes mean for people going through the courts, and how will these changes impact children? The amendments proposed in October of last year come after lengthy reviews of the law, with advocates pushing for change and following many inquiries into how the legislation actually operated. A massive issue in contention was the rights of the child and how children issues were dealt with under the Family Law Act. Back in 2006, under the Howard government, reform was made to create a presumption of equal shared parental responsibility, meaning that the law saw it as an important thing for a child to maintain a relationship with both of their parents after they have separated. This decision was made after considering pushes from family rights groups at the time. However, one of the major issues this presented was that the presumption could become dangerous to children where issues of domestic and family violence were involved. Where a judge did make an order for equal shared parental responsibility, they then also had to consider making orders for equal time for both parents to have with the child. And although there were exceptions to the presumption, they weren't always used. The new amendments, which come into effect on May 6th, remove the presumption of equal shared parental responsibility. The new reform shifts the safety of the child back into the main focus, with a new small list of factors for the courts to consider, which focus on the safety, the views, and the developmental needs of the child, and importantly, the benefits of having a relationship with both of the parents to the child. Those involved in the review and reform hope that the new changes will keep the safety of the child as the top priority for the courts.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
After the break, we fill you in on some heaps good news. Keep it on Fresh.
Wavelength.
It's hard to see the sun through the clouds, especially in this recent weather change. Here's some good news to help brighten things up.
Can't get enough. What's going on, Cass?
I know there's gonna be
Heaps good news on Wavelength.
Thank you, girls in the studio. It has been a little cold in Adelaide and the news headlines aren't always the brightest. So if you're struggling to chuck on a big old smile, don't stress. That's exactly why I'm here. Let's all take a big breath in and a big breath out. Let's get started. 4 cultural items have been returned to the Ghana people after 184 years in the German Museum. In a ceremony last Friday, the Foreign Minister for Germany returned the sword, club, spear, and net that were sent by Lutheran missionaries in 1840. Foodies gather round. Tasting Australia returns to South Australia to showcase the absolute best in food and wine that our great state has to offer. Not only is Tasting Australia absolutely delicious, but it is bringing tourism with 68,000 people visiting the CBD across the 10-day festival. And Surf's Up Aldinga. Get ready for a $100 million surf park with 2-metre waves and a dozen of short-stay villas to stay in. It will bring an estimated 320,000 visits each year and is set to begin construction in early 2026. Talk to me. No, I really mean it. Talk to me. South Aussie YouTube stars Danny and Michael Filippo, who directed the global sensation horror flick Talk to Me, has been greenlit for a second film. The original film came out last year, making a whopping $10 million debut and ranking the second biggest horror film release since Hereditary. This film is sure to show off the best SA filmmaking has to offer. And lastly, for all those students out there, with a countdown to the federal budget officially on, HECS indexation is set to be overhauled, with $3 billion in student debt being quote-unquote wiped out. Now, this is all pending, but will be introduced to Parliament in the coming months. But if it comes into place, could really offer some relief for cost of living for Aussies out there. Oh God, that's all I have time for. Back to you guys in the studio.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
And that brings us to the end of the show tonight. Thank you so much for listening.
Make sure you subscribe to the Wavelength podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts.
Wavelength.